So I'm going to get right into it. I'm not going to do this long intro, but I'm going to throw so much information at you in history about this whole Ukraine and Russia conflict that you probably haven't heard anything like this anywhere else. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, share the video. These videos have been getting censored, especially when you're not feeding into the general mainstream media narrative. So before I start, I do want to say, we all need to have an open mind. I'm extremely patriotic. I love my country. I'll die for this country. But I am well aware that the United States does overstep sometimes. And when it comes to war, it's not always black and white. In fact, it's probably never black and white. There's two sides. And that's kind of what I want to paint a picture of today. And if you hear me fumbling around papers, it's because I have all my notes and everything. Furthermore, I want to disclose that all the information I go over is from government policy and documents, official government documents, actual video evidence, and I have one essay from Brookings that is a very good information piece, and I'll link all of this stuff in the description so you can go and verify everything I'm saying as it is. So we need to go back to Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev. They start forming a very respective relationship with each other, something that has not yet occurred between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They made leaps and bounds, and even though Gorbachev was a communist, he still opened up the door for a more progressive Russia, or Soviet Union for that matter. When it came time to knock down the Berlin Wall and reunify Germany, James Baker, a U.S. official, and Western German leadership promised Gorbachev that NATO would not continue to expand past Germany. They just wanted the reunification, and that was it. He didn't need to worry about it. In 1991, Boris Yeltsin is elected as the president of Russia. Now, we need to understand when the Soviet Union existed, you had states, no different than like the United States, and you had the federal government and then you had the states. When the Soviet Union collapsed, this was due to Boris Yeltsin getting together with leadership in Ukraine and Belarus in a secret meeting, signing an agreement that ultimately dissolved the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Gorbachev, being the leader of the Soviet Union, was immediately undermined and had no more power. This was a successful coup attempt by Yeltsin. Yeltsin was favored by the United States. I'll get into that in a second, but following the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a few big things take place. The first is you now had these newly formed independent countries that just went from being a communist society to a free market society literally overnight. The economies of these countries were terrible. Inflation was skyrocketing. They had nothing. You had elderly people who had social welfare benefits that lost everything. Like, imagine losing Social Security when you're already in retirement and can't work anymore. That's what went on in these former Soviet states. The United States brings in three policies that really sway how this thing went. The first and most important one is the Freedom Support Act of 1992. It's on congress.gov. Again, I'll post a link. This is the summary of it. What the Freedom Support Act did was it was going to offer economic and humanitarian aid to these former Soviet states, as long as they abided by the rules and restrictions that this bill placed on them. It says that the goal of the bill was to provide immediate humanitarian needs, establishing a free society, or a democratic and free society, creating private enterprise and free market system based on the principle of private ownership of property, and promoting trade and investment. Now, myself as a fellow capitalist, I agree. It also prohibited any country, especially Russia, if it failed to make progress on the removal of troops from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and has failed to undertake good effort or good faith efforts to end other military practices that violate the sovereignty of the Baltic states. So, the next provision of this, and this opened the door for all the corruption you hear about with the whole Hunter Biden deal and these American businesses going over to Ukraine and taking advantage of a new emerging unregulated marketplace. It wasn't just Ukraine, it was all around the world, but this bill opened the door for it to happen in that region. Title III, Business and Commercial Development. It encourages the president to establish the American business centers in the independent states where the president determines that such centers can be cost-effective in promoting the objectives of Title II and U.S. economic interests and in establishing commercial partnerships between the United States and the independent states. The entire goal of this bill was to expand U.S. business interests in these new regions that they never had control before. It also made funds available from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation Program in these independent states. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation Program. I've talked about this on my show. That's the OPIC. The OPIC is the main driver of why politicians can get rich and make money in these, endeavors, and no one knows about it. I'll go into that more when I get there, but just remember the OPIC. Now, Title V of this agreement is the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Programs and Activities. It permits non-proliferation assistance to be obligated for an independent state only if the president has certified to the Congress that such state is committed to, 1, making a substantial investment of its resources for dismantling or destroying weapons of mass destruction if obligated to do so under an agreement. Foregoing, which is, by the way, under the another 1991 agreement of the Chemical, Biological, and Nuclear Weapons Removal Act. So they all were under this agreement. Foregoing any military modernization program that exceeds legitimate defense requirements and foregoing the replacement of destroyed weapons of mass destruction. 3, foregoing any use in nuclear weapons of components or destroyed nuclear weapons and facilitating U.S. verification of weapons destruction carried out under this act or the Soviet Nuclear Threat Reduction Act of 1991. So they had to get rid of their weapons programs. And the reason, you may be thinking, well, only Russia has them. No. Actually, Ukraine, I believe, became the second or third largest nuclear power as soon as the USSR collapsed. They had like 1,800 nuclear weapons. They also had the chemical and biological labs. So when all this happens, the USSR is now gone. You have independent states. But Russia had citizens that were actually stationed and living in these states. Russians. There were 700,000 Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Crimea was almost entirely Russian. Crimea also was home to the Black Fleet in Sevastopol, still is. So you had millions of Russian citizens that were immediately, illegally and unlawfully in these other states by the signing of a pen. Ukraine wanted all of the military servicemen and women that were Russian in Ukraine to pledge allegiance to Ukraine. And they also wanted ownership of all the weapons that were left in Ukraine. This didn't go down well with the Russians. Ukraine also relied almost entirely on Russian energy at this time. So I'm not going to go too in depth, but I will say that disputes between the two countries, territorial disputes and economic disputes, ended up with Russia using its own energy as leverage against Ukraine and threatening to completely cut it off. So this goes on through the 90s. Ukraine and Russia are experiencing inflation at like 50 to 100% per month. Think about that. Right now, we're experiencing 7.9% inflation. They were experiencing 50 to 100% per month. It was not a good time. We also had a Balkan conflict. That is another conflict, a complicated dispute that I'm not going to go in depth in, but that's your Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, that whole region. Russia gets involved. The United States came out with the Wolfowitz Doctrine, or formerly known as the Bush Doctrine. What this was it was the defense strategy for the U.S. between 1994 and 1999. It was written in 1992, though. It was a classified document, but it was leaked to the New York Times. You can go back and find this on Google. And the ultimate goal of that document was to reevaluate the U.S. military strategy around the world. We just spent 70 years spending countless dollars building countless weapons and technology to try and win the Cold War and protect us from a possible Soviet threat. The Soviet threat was gone. So the United States was now the sole superpower of the world. China isn't even in the picture yet. They're sole superpower. And the Wolfowitz Doctrine basically says that we will remain the sole superpower and we will never let another country challenge us. In these non-democratic countries, you're a threat, and we're going to take care of you. And we're going to squash international threats before it happens because we left this job up to the Englands and the Frances back in World War I and World War II, and both times they failed. And it ended up costing not just millions of lives in Europe, but hundreds of thousands of American lives for a war that they didn't even start. Another portion, going back to World War I and World War II, is both times the United States drew down its forces following the wars and kind of shifted focus away from the military. And both times they were caught standing flat-footed and unprepared. You had Pearl Harbor, and then they even go as far as using the Korean War as an example, when quoted in there, the United States was almost pushed off of the entire peninsula into the water by a third-rate power. And they will never let that happen again. You know, hindsight, we see that it did, but that was the writing of this doctrine. Now, another important aspect of this is that we are going to build a democratic defense community, NATO, and we're going to expand it. And we're actually going to focus on getting Ukraine and a democratic Russia into this community. We want them in this community. But they need to be democratic. They need to follow our rules. We're also going to build up our forces so strong that the United States will be able to take care of itself. We're going to grow partnerships, and we're going to utilize our allies. And in some cases, we're going to make it seem like, you know, these other organizations, like a regional organization, or maybe the UN is in control and they're taking the lead, right? And we're just helping out. We're going to give it that appearance, but in reality, it's the United States that controls it. And if our allies don't want to get on board, then we don't need them. We'll do it ourselves. And as we see, they've done a good job at building our military up to do that. We could take care of anything at the moment. And they said, you know, we're going to remain the biggest and baddest force to ever walk this earth right now and for the foreseeable future. That was the objective of that defense strategy. But it focused on protecting American interest, be it defense interest, strategic, economic interest, whatever, all around the world. So when you ask, why are we getting into these little conflicts everywhere, it all derives from that doctrine. Russia had to sit back and reevaluate its own military strategy as well. And I'm going to read kind of what that involves. So in the Balkan conflict, Russia ended up getting involved, which immediately barred them from receiving any assistance under the Freedom Support Act. And Russia said, hey, allow us to use our peacekeepers and send peacekeepers into this region, because we've been keeping peace here for the last couple hundred years. And we know the cultures, and allow us, just pay us to do it. Sounds like a good deal, but the United States was skeptical about their intentions and said that given Russia's history, they actually tend to go in and incite more violence than they do squashing the violence. So they said no. Now, some of Russia's objectives, and this is from their documentation. It says Russia's current objectives, which closely parallel its historic geostrategic objectives, include guaranteeing its access to warm water ports in the Black Sea and Baltic Seas. By the way, the only warm water port going into the Black Sea is the Dnieper River that splits Ukraine. Maintaining a buffer zone between Russia and its traditional rivals Turkey, Iran, and China. You have Kazakhstan as kind of a buffer between China, even though they do have a border with China. And you have Georgia, the Chechnya area would border it, or would keep that buffer between them and Turkey, and plus the Black Sea. And then Iran, you have all the other Middle Eastern countries that they're over. And the European powers to the west. So they had Belarus, they had the Baltic states still at that time, and then they have Ukraine. Preserving the Russian hegemony in the region and preventing other regional powers from emerging. Retaining control over raw materials in the former republics, including oil, gas, and minerals, which there was dispute between in Ukraine about this. Ensuring access to industrial facilities in former republics. Retaining control over the defense industrial complex in the former republics, and including nuclear power plants and nuclear hardware, and guaranteeing markets for its products. It also enumerates the following as being sources for external threat which Russia will act on militarily: a territorial claim on Russia if on Russia and its allies, current and potential hotbeds of local wars and armed conflicts in the vicinity of Russian borders, possible utilization of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, the suppression of rights, freedoms, and legitimate interests of Russian-speaking citizens in foreign states, and attacks on Russian armed forces and military facilities in foreign countries. This was written in the 90s. This whole Ukraine conflict contains violations of all of those. All of them, literally. Ukraine has a civil war going on right at Russia's border. They don't want the expansion of NATO. They don't want, the suppression of rights and freedoms and legitimate interests of Russian-speaking citizens in foreign states. In Ukraine, they tried to make Russia, I believe, the second language. There's something there. They tried to, or it may have been the opposite way around, but they tried to actually suppress the Russians in Ukraine and the Russian-speaking people. And then the protection of nuclear threats. You see Putin going in there and bombing nuclear power plants. Moving on, though, the first part of those about their interest: warm water ports, maintaining a buffer zone, which they were losing, and combating the rise of international powers in that region, which is NATO. All Russia's doing right now is abiding by their own defense strategy, which, by the way, the United States would do the exact same thing. But how did we get here? So Yeltsin was actually backed by the United States. The United States favored him heavily. Right here it says that the United States government does not want to be perceived as guilty of having lost Russia, but does it want to be responsible for the loss of 14 newly independent states. They need to weigh the two. Although no one in the administration has suggested publicly that these states are expendable, the U.S. is acquiescing in the de facto reconstitution of the USSR by turning its head as Russia maneuvers its way back into the affairs of all its former republics. The details in this report suggest that while Yeltsin is still in power, and while the U.S. retains a degree of influence with Russian government, the United States should give serious consideration to alternative policies, as, for example, be tough on the issue of the Baltic states and demand that Russia quickly comply with its agreement to withdraw troops from Estonia and Latvia. Oppose attempts by Russia to install Russian peacekeepers unilaterally in the former Soviet republics. Do not simply farm off responsibility to allied regional powers such as Turkey. Make symbolic moves in the region to demonstrate that the entire U.S. policy is not Moscow-centric, such as initiating high-level meetings with heads of state that are not simply an adjunct to meetings in Moscow, inviting heads of state to Washington, D.C., offering high-profile technical assistance to individual states for the development of key infrastructure, creating prestigious fellowship programs for each individual state, rather than for the former Soviet republics as a bloc. So they wanted to identify each one of these countries as their own country, and they wanted Russia to abide by the principles that they laid out in the Freedom Support Act. Otherwise, they were actually going to favor taking the side of the newly independently formed countries instead of Russia. That was the U.S. thinking when it came to this. Now, Yeltsin becomes a drunk, or he may have already been a drunk, but he becomes really bad. He's an alcoholic. In 1998, towards the end of his reign, I think the United States is actually seeing Yeltsin kind of, he's on his way out. So what does NATO do? NATO goes and breaks their promise that was made to Gorbachev, and they expand and take in 3 countries. Yeltsin questions this move. And the United States, or Yeltsin says, hey, you guys made a promise you weren't going to expand. The United States says, no, we promised the Soviet Union that we wouldn't expand NATO. We didn't promise Russia. And even if we did, that agreement wasn't even formal. It wasn't even written down. That didn't go down well. Now Putin comes into office in 2000. The first thing Putin does is ask to join NATO. When he asked to join NATO, he asked to bypass the application process and jump in front of the line past the countries that don't matter. Quote, this is all documented. And NATO said no. Now remember, in the Wolfowitz Doctrine, their whole objective was to get a democratic Russia into NATO. But they didn't want to be lenient on Russia, so they said no. They denied him access. Then, Putin asked to join the European Union. He gets the same answer, no. When 9/11 happens, Putin reaches out to George Bush and offers him all the support that he wants. Russia even allowed the U.S. military to use their infrastructure in the Middle East to carry out operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Russia gets absolutely nothing in return. Actually, what they get is further expansion of NATO. NATO keeps continuing east. So Putin is looking at this and saying, they deny me access. They deny Russia access to NATO, but they keep expanding NATO. Well, that must mean that NATO is actually hostile towards Russia, and they're perceiving Russia as the threat and the reason for expansion. NATO was initially created to protect Europe and the world from Soviet aggression. And Putin states that since the Soviet Union is no longer around, there's really no legitimate reason for NATO to exist. So it's definitely not legitimate if you're not going to let the second world power join, but you're going to let the other states join. I thought about this a little bit. What I think the reason is the United States looked at Russia's defense strategy and how they wanted to intervene in these former Soviet republics. And if Russia joined NATO and kept their strategy and kept intervening in these regions, NATO would be forced to back them. And they weren't going to have that. That seems pretty reasonable to me. I don't know what kind of talks, derived around that concept. I'm sure they discussed it. But the more I thought about it, that to me is why they didn't want Russia in NATO. They also knew they weren't going to be able to control Russia as much as they were the other countries. And this shows in 2004 in Ukraine, there's a presidential election between Viktor Yuschenko and Viktor Yanukovych. Viktor Yuschenko is Western-backed. Not only is he Western-backed, but his wife worked in the Reagan administration at the White House. We know him pretty well. Viktor Yanukovych is the opposite. He's actually a Russian-leaning, candidate. The election takes place, and Ukraine's vote is split right down the middle. It's a very close election, and Eastern Ukraine votes in favor of the pro-Russian candidate, and Western Ukraine votes in favor of Yushchenko. Yanukovych wins. The pro-Russian candidate wins. Immediately, the West cries, fraud. And protests spark up in Ukraine because everyone's thinking that this election is fraudulent. Now, I want you to think about this. The United States asked Ukraine and these other states to become democratic, become free market societies, which they were trying to. And the first time they go out, not the first time, but, when they actually go out and have a democratic vote, and the United States doesn't like the candidate that wins, they say, nah, fuck that. We're voting again. And they actually negotiate another vote. When that vote's finished, Viktor Yushchenko is now the winner, the Western-backed candidate. So they just ousted the guy that didn't want. That's 2004. That's the start of the Orange Revolution. So around the same time, in 2005, this is where it starts getting sketchy. A new senator, a young president, or soon to be president, but a new senator, Barack Obama, and Senator Richard Lugar take a trip to Ukraine. And they broker an agreement, a weapons proliferation agreement. And what the agreement is some people thought that it meant that, they wanted Ukraine to give up their biological and weapons programs. No, actually, all it did was create a partnership between the Department of Defense and the Ukrainian Ministry of Health with these labs. These biolabs exist. They 100% exist. There's undeniable evidence from our own government that they exist. So don't listen to any fact checker. What the Department of Defense wanted is they wanted to be able to contract private businesses from the United States to come and operate and perform the research and construct these labs. And any of the research that was conducted with pathogens or anything else in these labs was to remain confidential, completely confidential, and only shared between the U.S. Department of Defense and the Ukrainian Ministry of Health. So that actually would be a violation, though, of the Freedom Support Act of 1991. Now, I do want to bring up the nuclear weapons. The Budapest Memorandum in 1994, Ukraine had to give up all their nuclear weapons. They had 1,800 of them. Ukraine was initially, during the 90s, using these weapons as leverage, trying to keep Russia off their back. But the United States saw that there was an ensuing conflict happening, and Russia was worried that Ukraine was going to end up using them too. So Russia and the United States actually get together along with the UK, and they agree that, we'll recognize Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. The US even agreed to protect Ukraine, but Ukraine needed to give up their nuclear weapons. They did. They gave up all of them. But they still had the bio and chemical labs. That was still a violation of the Freedom Support Act. Now it's not. Immediately following this agreement with Barack Obama, which they funded $15 million for, Congress puts in legislation in the form of the Nunn-Lugar Act of 2005, which I believe the official one that was passed was the Nunn-Lugar Act of 2007. It's the same bill. What this did was it repealed the provisions in the Freedom Support Act of 1991 regarding the former Soviet states and receiving aid. It says that now they can actually, under supervision, do these weapons programs. They can do the biological research in these facilities. They're allowed to and still receive aid from the U.S. government, but they need to abide by U.S. regulations, and they need to contract American businesses to come over and do the research or help out with it. It needed to be a joint effort, and that repealed the restrictions in the first act. So the timing is impeccable. They just overthrow an election. They replace Ukraine's president with the guy that they wanted, and then they go over and immediately start brokering agreements to allow private businesses to partake in the economy in Ukraine. The president, Yuschenko, his presidency was an absolute dud. The only notable thing he actually did was give Stepan Bandera hero status. Stepan Bandera is a known Nazi that was from Ukraine, fought in World War II, and was suspected of killing over 30,000 Jews. So this guy the U.S. just put in just gave hero status to a Nazi. A new election comes along, 2010. Viktor Yanukovych wins that election. No questions asked, hands down. He's the Russian-backed candidate. Immediately, he's trying to find solutions to boost Ukraine's economy because it is in the shitter. And per interviews with him, he says he had two options on the table. They were hoping to strike a deal with the International Monetary Fund, which was created for these purposes and help these poor, newer economies grow. But the offer that the IMF made to Ukraine was going to be extremely costly, and it wasn't feasible. They tried to negotiate with the IMF, and ultimately the IMF refused any more negotiations, so it didn't work out. The other option was a free trade agreement with Russia. Russia had opened its hands, put its hand down and said, look, we want to, you have a very pro-Russian society, at least half of your country is Russian and Russian-speaking. Let's have open borders, let's have open trade. All of your produce and your farm stuff, bring it over, sell it on the Russian market, we'll help you out. And they do that. But at the same time, Ukraine starts trying to broker a relationship with the European Union. Putin had told Yanukovych that we can do the free trade agreement, but you need to keep Russian interests in mind above anything else. And the EU deal that was being brokered was going to allow European goods, because of this free trade agreement with Ukraine and Russia, to come through Ukraine and into Russia without any negotiations. And Putin was not going to have that. It was going to flood the Russian markets and crush Russian businesses potentially. So soon after, around November 2013, Yanukovych tells the EU that we're halting negotiations. We're not moving forwards with it, and we're going to halt negotiations with Russia as well. My opinion now. Why did he do it? I think obviously Putin didn't want to join the EU, but I think the United States was very aggravated because they were trying to expand their sphere of influence into Ukraine. And having them partnered with the European Union gives the U.S. substantial influence in Ukraine. So when they halted that, now you see protests spark up from opposition groups being those that oppose Viktor Yanukovych. These opposition groups are actually funded, with evidence by the way, by the NED, which is the National Endowment for Democracy. Started in the Reagan administration. Reagan changed this. It used to be the CIA that would go and fund political activist groups in other countries. He said no more. Now it's going to be the NED. The NED not only funded these protests, but they also funded 3 new TV stations, along with a organization started by George Soros. All this will be in the description. There's actual evidence of Soros talking about this. This isn't a secret. The goal of these TV stations was to just inject a massive propaganda campaign against Viktor Yanukovych. These protests, the first night, end up getting violent. The news says that the police went and started, beating on the protesters that were sleeping in tents. But when you watch the footage, the protesters were actually coming in and throwing Molotov cocktails, rocks, bats, all that stuff, and abusing the police, and this huge retaliation. These trained groups were actually paid off by the United States, like an Antifa group, which, by the way, they use the same symbols as Black Lives Matter, all these groups that the United States has been involved with, so keep that in mind, to go in, spark this conflict and these protests, and they knew that it would piss people off because now people thought that Viktor Yanukovych gave the police orders to go and start beating on the protesters. So the protests ended up growing, and they ended up getting more violent. Now, a string of events occurred, but the one that really sticks out is John McCain and other high-up U.S. officials go to Ukraine, and they give a speech to the protesters in Kiev, and they state their support for the protesters in their attempt to overthrow the government of Ukraine. Now, I want you to think, imagine riots happening in Washington, D.C., but a foreign, like Vladimir Putin, or one of his henchmen, like high-up people, that is well known around the world, because John McCain just got done running for a presidential election at this point. Everyone knew who he was. Coming over, standing in front of the White House, giving a speech to the protesters and said, "We support you in your attempt to overthrow the U.S. government." There would be a war. And that's what the U.S. did. Victoria Nuland and the ambassador, Geoffrey Piet, is also has a recorded phone call of them discussing staging a coup to oust Viktor Yanukovych. Ultimately, when Viktor Yanukovych is in Kharkiv, these protesters go and seize his personal residence and officially the entire government in Kiev. Now, this is after very violent protests, right? But Viktor Yanukovych now has no choice but to flee and seek asylum in Russia. Following this incident, a temporary government kind of came into place until a new one was established. A temporary government was those far right-leaning people, those, Azov, you see it on the news, that Nazi group that's in the military. Those are the type of people that are now controlling the Ukrainian government temporarily. That's where the whole denazification deal comes in. They get a new government, but a massive civil war strikes up in the eastern part of Ukraine, which, by the way, the eastern part of Ukraine is pro-Russian. So they are trying to pull away and secede. Crimea, it's in 2014. Crimea was not officially a part of Ukraine. Some people say it was, some people say it wasn't. There's a lot of stuff that goes back. Russia claims that, when Crimea was given to Ukraine, it was illegal. Then you have a lot of stuff. But there is a fact. The fact is that Russia has had soldiers in Crimea forever. Sevastopol is home to the Black Fleet. The other thing is that they didn't invade Crimea. Crimea asked to be annexed by Russia. And when they held a vote, 95% of the people living in Crimea that voted in support of joining Russia. Those numbers aren't coming from Russia. Those numbers are actually coming from United States entities that ran the polls and got the data. A legitimate 95% of Crimeans wanted to join Russia. So this kind of goes back, though. Why would we keep saying, well, why? They're saying it's an invasion. Remember, this is 2014. You know what else happened in 2014? So they just get rid of Viktor Yanukovych, and the U.S. basically implements the government that they want. Rosemont Seneca, who is Hunter Biden's business, that he started with Devon Archer and Christopher Hines, who's John Kerry's stepson, and Devon Archer was a senior political advisor on John Kerry's presidential campaign, by the way. He's in jail for securities fraud and conspiracy. But Christopher Hines and Hunter Biden aren't. They started Rosemont Seneca. They go over and they start investing in businesses. The businesses they invest in, CH2M, Hill, Metabiota, Black & Veatch, all of them are the ones that are doing the operations at the Biolabs in Ukraine. This is a government contract, an official government contract. Issued July 28th, 2021, just last year. It's for $3.6 million, and they are looking for an entity to go over to Ukraine and basically clean up these biolabs and continue work that CH2M Hill was doing. They state, quote, this is the government stating this just last year, that there was a substantial risk that the Ukrainian government was going to start operating these labs, which had a license to work with the most dangerous pathogens, the highest level of pathogens there are, without any approval or any oversight from any foreign regulator. So they needed someone to go in there and make sure that they were going to, do it the right way. Obviously, Russia sees this. But this is a real contract. These labs exist. Anyone that's denying that this stuff's not going on, it is. And the Bidens have a hand in it. Rosemont Seneca actually themselves stated the relationship between these companies and said that they were financial backers to them and listed these companies out on their website. CH2M Hill is kind of like it evolved to CH2M Hill. It was Hill International, who was owned by one of Biden's friends. Hillstone International is a subsidiary of Hill International. Hillstone International got government contracts with no experience to go and start rebuilding buildings and construction progress in Iraq after the war. Joe Biden's brother, with no construction past, was the vice president of Hillstone International. So it's a big circle here. Hunter Biden also sat on the board of Burisma. So did Devon Archer. Burisma is the largest energy company in Ukraine. Burisma was started in 2002. In 2006, it consolidated, but one of the businesses that it consolidated with was, let me see if I can find it, it's the Sunrise Energy Resources. Sunrise Energy Resources was started in 1991 following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The timing of this is it's just crazy. No experience at all, no operations at all. But their agenda was to go and do developmental gas and gas production in Ukraine. Also with exploratory stuff as well in Ukraine. In 2004, they finally get a license following the presidential election overthrow there. They finally get a license, and in 2005, they start doing operations in Ukraine. Again, 2005 is that Nunn-Lugar Act, when they've repealed all the restrictions and allowed these businesses to go over from the U.S. and start making money. These businesses are funded by the OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. It's a government entity, and the OPIC provides these American businesses with guaranteed loans, but also gives them political risk insurance. Political risk insurance in countries that are already politically risky. It is no differently, what the OPIC is doing is no different than a life insurance company approving insurance for a dead guy and then paying the claim because he died. No one does that except our government. And every country that the OPIC was funding and giving insurance to were countries that all either already had a conflict ongoing or very soon after had a conflict. And there's a reason why. So Congo, Afghanistan, Georgia, Ukraine, Venezuela. You have stuff going on in Mexico that's politically risky. There's so many of these other, Egypt, right? All of them had an uprising or some kind of conflict. And all of those conflicts, Libya is another one, by the way. All of these conflicts, are usually tend to come back, and there's theories about the United States being involved in it. Well, when you get a claim on this insurance, you don't report it as income, and it's not taxable. And it's replacing your potential lost revenue for this year, but also for future projections. And that's how these politicians, because these businesses are very politically connected, these politicians are getting a cut of it because there's no one tracking it. Congress is the one that also dictates who's getting this money. They're in the driver's seat to cutting the checks to the businesses that they want to go over there. Why the fuck is a business that started in Delaware, by the way? Sunrise Energy Resources was started in Delaware in 1991. Kind of a coincidence. No experience, and we're going to give them loans and political risk insurance to go into a fucking conflict-ridden country where the election just got overthrown by the United States, basically, and allow them to start doing oil operations. Well, when Crimea was annexed, Burisma had subsidiaries in Crimea that basically controlled all of the energy production in Crimea. When it was annexed, those operations halted. Russia halted those operations. Now you know why the United States is calling it an invasion of Crimea when it wasn't. There were no shots fired, nothing. It was not an invasion. They're calling it that, though, because of money. They lost money because their operations were cut off. Now you have this civil war going on that breaks out, and it becomes a bad civil war. The Ukraine actually deploys its military into this region, and they are going at it. Over 20,000 people end up dying from this war. And Ukraine was having bombing campaigns with fighter jets, all of that. And the other side wasn't innocent either, because Russia was backing them. It's no different than what we're seeing right now. It just wasn't actually Russia involved at that point directly. So they end up having a ceasefire agreement in Minsk. This is the Minsk agreements. In 2017, after the Minsk agreements, Ukraine puts it in their constitution that they're going to join NATO. In 2019, Zelenskyy signs off on a new security agreement that kind of solidifies stronger ties with the United States and also reaffirms that Ukraine is going to join NATO. Now, the question is, well, why didn't Putin invade then? You have two reasons, I think. Now, some people may not like my first answer, but Trump was elected in 2016. I think Putin knew what he was getting with other politicians that had been in the industry for 40 years. The Bidens, the Obamas, the Clintons, all that. He expected. Trump was an outsider and very unpredictable. I believe Trump also told him that if he went into Ukraine, he was going to bomb Moscow. I don't know how true that is, but I think it just got Putin thinking that he didn't want to deal with an unpredictable person. I also think that in 2020 we had COVID, and the pandemic probably delayed any invasion that was going to end up taking place. But Putin has been wide open on his opinion on NATO expansion, and he does not want a NATO country on his border, even though they do on the northwest border now with the Baltic states. But he did not want Ukraine, especially because that gives up another warm water port. But he doesn't want the United States putting military establishments in Ukraine right on Russia's borders, and having missiles right on Russia's borders. He also knows that the Russian military is far inferior to NATO, and that any confrontation between the two would ultimately have to be defended with nuclear weapons from Russia. He's said this. He's said this for a while now. So, there's a lot of speculation there, but I think that a lot of the United States interests in this region were actually genuine at the beginning with the Wolfowitz Doctrine and what they were trying to do. I can completely understand what the United States was trying to achieve. And when you read the Russian defense strategy, it makes it even more understandable on why the tensions with Russia never were cured. But I think that those interests have long evolved since 1992. And I think now the U.S. interests are more of a financial and business interest, not for the U.S. economy, not for the U.S. citizens, but for the people that are making these decisions, the politicians that are going and getting a cut of all of these businesses over in these regions. There's too much evidence, there's too much that supports their financial dealings in these nations, and I think it's a shame, honestly. Because I think that maybe some of this conflict wasn't going to be avoided, but we probably didn't need to be involved at all, and I think we definitely put gas on the fire. And not to mention, it's illegal for what the politicians are doing. It's highly illegal. Because they're not acting in our best interest anymore. They're acting in their own best interest, which is the exact opposite of how it's supposed to be. They're serving us, not themselves. So that's kind of a good overview. I'm going to probably end up doing another video going more in depth on the whole business side of this and the economic stuff that went on in the early 90s between Russia and Ukraine, and then other areas of the world as well. But this is really important to know, because you're not going to hear this from the mainstream media. You're not going to hear that the U.S. backed these protests, that we are a large part in all of this conflict, and Russia is actually just going and abiding by their own defense strategy that they wrote 30 years ago. And the United States would do the same thing. The other thing, just recently, yesterday, they uncovered the mass graves. I can't remember the city's name. It was like 410 Ukrainian civilians that were killed. Some of them tortured, some of them executed. They're blaming it on Russian soldiers. I was listening to the UN meeting today, and I was listening to the Russian representative talk. I'll say this. Don't jump to conclusions, especially given the history of opposition and protest and how those were artificially created to achieve a goal. Do not jump to conclusions on who did this human rights violation. Because our president, Biden, just last week was calling for regime change. Whether the White House says it or not, he, quote, said, Putin cannot remain in power. He's long accused Putin of being a war criminal. And all of a sudden now we have these killings, this murder situation, and they are now calling for Putin to be brought up on charges in trial. So do not think for a second that we wouldn't back up Biden's claims and trying to force a regime change, but doing it in a legal sense and bringing him up on trial and prosecuting him for what he's done in Ukraine. So just, again, take everything with a grain of salt. Keep an open mind. Just understand that this is a big gray area, and there's two sides to every situation. So if you like the video, hit subscribe. We're going to do more, and be sure to check us out. Real Conservative Talk. We're usually on every day at 6 Central. Thank you.